We turn today to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 9. We saw how Paul was drawing a contrast between spiritually minded co-workers of God and carnal Christians who were living as babies, spiritual babies. And he says we, referring to Paul himself and Apollos, his co-worker, he says we are God's fellow workers. God himself is working along with us. And we are just servants together with God who is seeking to minister to you. But you have not yet come to the place where you can be a fellow worker of God. You are God's field, needing cultivation. And he says you are God's building, a building being built. I have come there, he says in verse 10, according to the grace of God which was given to me, and the work God gave me as a wise master builder, I laid a foundation. Paul had the privilege of laying the foundation of beginning the church in Corinth. And that's described in Acts chapter 18. When Paul went to Corinth, there were no Christians there. They were all heathen. And when Paul left Corinth, after about a couple of years, there was a church. And so Paul had laid the foundation of that church, and another is building on it. Apollos came a little later, and he took part in that building. And now Apollos also had left, and there were others in the church in Corinth who were continuing that work of building. But he says, let everyone be careful how he builds upon this foundation. As far as the foundation is concerned, he says, there is no other foundation other than that which God himself has laid, and that is Jesus Christ. It's not Paul that is the foundation. If you build your life on Paul, it will collapse. That is sand and not rock. Jesus Christ alone is the rock foundation on which the church can be built. And so he's really continuing the same theme of not building your life on men or on any particular ministry. That foundation has been laid. That is Jesus Christ. That is the house that can be built on the rock. And Jesus, of course, said in Matthew chapter 7 that that rock on which the wise man built his house was actually obedience to his word. It is the foundation of obedience to Jesus Christ on which the true church is built. When we compare 1 Corinthians 3:11 with Matthew 7 verse 24 to 27, we come to that conclusion. It is not merely an intellectual faith, but a faith which produces works of obedience, as James chapter 2 says. Such faith is a living faith, and such a man has got a solid foundation for all eternity, the foundation which God himself has laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, on this foundation, here is an evangelist or an apostle who comes along in a particular place and lays a foundation of Jesus Christ and him crucified, and leads people to faith and obedience in that foundation, and the beginning has been laid for the church of Jesus Christ to be built in that locality. Now, on top of that foundation, verse 12, all of us are building, he says. And if any man builds upon the foundation with various types of materials, well, every man's work is going to be tested one day. There are two alternatives which we can use for building on top of this foundation. First of all, gold, silver, and precious stones or jewels. The other alternative is we could use wood, hay, that is dry grass, and straw. And you know the difference that when these are put into the fire, because he says in verse 13 that one day all of our work is going to be tested by fire. And in that day, he says, every man's work will become evident. Today, it is not evident. A lot of Christian work that is done today, its real character is not evident because it has not yet been tested. God's work throughout the world for 20 centuries has not been tested yet. The day of testing is yet in the future. And so we cannot assess a work perfectly by our human assessments. No, every man's work will become evident in that day. For that day, he says, will show it, because it will be revealed with fire. In other words, everything we do to put up this building is going to be finally tested with fire. And the fire, he says, will test only one thing. And notice the word used here in verse 13, the quality of each man's work. Not the quantity, which is where human beings place their emphasis, but the quality. Christian work in the world today, unfortunately, is assessed in terms of quantity. That is, number of souls saved, the amount of money in the offering box, our budget, if it keeps increasing, we think God is prospering us, the size of a building, the size of the congregation, and everything is in terms of numbers. And that is what impresses men. But Luke 16:15 says, what impresses men is an abomination in God's eyes. In the final day, the fire of God is going to test our work not in terms of its size, not in terms of how big a work we were able to build in our earthly lifetime, how many people or how large a building or how large a congregation, but rather the quality of each man's work. In other words, did it have the divine nature? The people whom you brought to Christ, did they become disciples? And then, if any man's work which he has built upon this foundation remains, he shall receive a reward. A reward is going to be given to all those who have built with gold, silver, and jewels. Because when you put gold, silver, and jewels into the fire, they remain. When you put wood, hay, and straw into the fire, it's going to be burnt up. And so if we know that this is the way God's going to test our work in the final day, not by quantity, but by quality, for we know that even if we have built a building with 1 ton of wood, when that building is put into the fire, it's going to be burnt up to ashes completely. But if we have used even a few grams of gold, that is going to remain. And that is the contrast. Wood, hay, and straw, no matter how big their size, no matter how great their weight, will all be reduced to ashes. Whereas gold, silver, and precious stones, mentioned in verse 12, though little in quantity, is going to remain in the final day when it goes through the fire. And if any man's work is burnt up, verse 15, he shall suffer loss. He himself may be saved, because his sins are forgiven, but his entire lifetime's work is destroyed, because the fire tests the quality of his work, and it does not pass God's test, even though men may have been impressed with his labors during his lifetime. And this teaches us the absolute folly and stupidity of seeking the honor of men and the appreciation of men in our labors, because that is not what is going to matter in the final day. In Romans and chapter 11, we read this word, for all things are from God, Romans 11:36, through God and to God. To him be the glory forever and ever. 3 phrases, from God, through God, and to God, in Romans 11:36. And those 3 phrases indicate what is gold, silver, and precious stones. If my labor has originated from God, that is in God's will, if it has been accomplished through God, that is in God's power, and if it has been accomplished to God, that is for God's glory, then my work will remain forever. The fire would have tested it according to Romans 11:36, and I'll come through the fire shining, burning, triumphant. But on the other hand, if my work has originated from myself, that is according to my own schemes and plans, and has been done through myself, that is with my own abilities and resources and money and talents and human abilities, and it has been done to myself, that is for my own honor and glory, then it is wood, hay, and straw. I'll come through the fire now, not shining, but reduced to ashes. So this is the test of 1 Corinthians 3:12. What is the origin of my work? Is it from God or is it from myself? Is it according to God's will or my will? Secondly, what is the power by which I do God's work? Is it my human abilities and talents and resources, or is it the mighty power of God's Holy Spirit? And thirdly, what is the ultimate end and motive with which all of God's work is done? Is it God's glory or my honor? The origin, the power, and the motive of our work is going to matter much more in the final day than the quantity of our work. Let's never forget that. He who is wise in this matter can build in such a way that his lifetime's labor will not be lost in the final day of judgment.